wasn't looking for Vatican documents when I started this research. I was examining 19th century ecclesiastical correspondence, trying to understand how the Catholic Church documented territorial changes and population movements across Europe and Asia during the 1870s. Standard historical research into church administrative practices, the kind of work that fills academic journals with careful analysis of missionary reports, diocesan boundaries, and pastoral challenges in expanding or changing territories. The Catholic Church in the 1870s maintained one of the world's most extensive information networks, with priests, missionaries, and diplomatic representatives throughout regions where secular governments had minimal presence or authority. Church correspondence from this period provides historians with detailed observations about social, political, and economic changes occurring in remote areas that other institutional sources didn't document comprehensively. But in the margins of academic papers, in footnotes of scholarly articles about Vatican archival collections, in the bibliographic references of dissertations examining Catholic missionary work in Central Asia, I kept encountering something that didn't fit the expected patterns of ecclesiastical documentation. Allusions to documents from 1874 that supposedly mentioned Tartaria by name in official Vatican correspondence. Time equals 1.8 seconds / not Tartary, the vague European geographical designation that appears in some historical atlases and diplomatic correspondence as a general term for inner Asian regions that European powers understood incompletely. Not Tartar territories or lands of the Tartars, the kind of ethnic or cultural references that appear occasionally in missionary reports about diverse populations in Russia and Central Asia. Tartaria. The specific term that appears in alternative historical frameworks but that mainstream academic consensus insists never existed as a legitimate political or geographical entity deserving of diplomatic recognition or administrative attention from major European institutions like the Vatican. The Vatican. Secret archives contain millions of documents spanning centuries of Catholic Church administration, diplomacy, and correspondence. Access is restricted and carefully controlled. Researchers must apply for specific permissions to examine particular collections, and they're supervised during their work. The archival system is professional, comprehensive, and designed to preserve historical accuracy. When researchers cite Vatican documents in academic work, they provide specific collection references, document dates, and archival catalog numbers that allow other scholars to verify their sources. This is standard practice in professional historical research. So when I found multiple references to 1874 Vatican documents mentioning Tartaria, my first assumption was that these were legitimate scholarly citations that I should be able to trace and verify. The problem is verification. The academic papers that reference these documents are published in legitimate journals by credentialed historians. But when I attempted to follow their footnotes back to the original sources, the trail becomes difficult to trace. The citations reference Vatican archival collections that exist, but with document numbers and filing systems that don't align with current Vatican archival organization. Some papers cite documents that were supposedly examined during research visits in the 1980s and 1990s before digital cataloging systems were implemented. Others reference materials that were allegedly transferred between collections or reclassified under different filing systems during archival reorganization projects. The documents are cited as existing, but they've become inaccessible through normal scholarly channels. This could be explained through ordinary archival complexity. The Vatican archives are vast, and their organization has evolved over centuries. Documents get misfiled, collections get reorganized, catalog systems change. Researchers working decades ago might have used filing systems that no longer match current organization. Access restrictions change. Some materials become unavailable for conservation reasons. Some get reclassified for security or diplomatic sensitivity. The inaccessibility of specific documents doesn't necessarily mean those documents never existed. But the pattern of inaccessibility, specifically around documents that allegedly mention Tartaria, is notable. Let me describe what these academic references claim the 1874 documents contained and why their alleged contents would be significant for understanding 19th century political geography if they could be verified. According to the scholarly papers that cite them, the Vatican correspondence from that year includes exchanges between papal diplomatic representatives stationed in Russia and Central Asia, and Vatican administrators in Rome responsible for coordinating missionary activities and diplomatic relations throughout the region. The correspondence supposedly discussed territorial and population changes occurring throughout regions that the Vatican documents referred to using specific language. The former territories of Tartaria, lands previously under Tartarian administration, and populations displaced from Tartarian governance structures. The academic papers suggest these Vatican sources treated Tartaria not as a vague geographical designation used by Europeans who lacked detailed knowledge of Asian political arrangements, but as a specific, recently extinguished political entity that had exercised actual administrative control over substantial territories and populations until very recently. The alleged content becomes more specific and more historically significant in some citations. Vatican diplomatic correspondence supposedly described populations in Central Asian and Siberian regions who claimed to be remnants of Tartarian administrative structures, but who could no longer be governed or provided with services through traditional mechanisms because those mechanisms had been systematically eliminated or disrupted through processes that the Vatican observers couldn't fully understand or explain. Church officials supposedly discussed the practical challenge this presented for providing pastoral care to communities whose social, political, and economic organization didn't align with either Russian imperial administrative structures or traditional Catholic diocesan systems that had been designed to work within established governmental frameworks. Some documents allegedly describe these populations as recently displaced, rather than simply existing in remote areas with limited governmental contact, suggesting that recent events had fundamentally changed their circumstances rather than their circumstances representing historically stable patterns of limited state authority in frontier regions. The Vatican correspondence supposedly discussed communities that had been accessible to Catholic missionaries through established trade routes and communication networks, but that were suddenly scattered, relocated, or rendered inaccessible, requiring entirely new approaches to maintain contact with populations that had maintained Catholic faith despite administrative and social disruption. The ecclesiastical perspective on these changes would have been particularly important because the Catholic Church maintained institutional relationships and communication networks that operated independently of secular diplomatic and governmental systems. Where Russian imperial administrators might have political reasons to present territorial changes as successful expansion of imperial control, or where European diplomatic correspondents might reflect incomplete understanding of remote Asian political arrangements. Vatican sources would have been motivated primarily by pastoral concerns about maintaining contact with Catholic populations regardless of which governmental structures claimed authority over them. Church officials would have had practical reasons to understand and document political changes accurately because their missionary and pastoral work required adapting to actual conditions rather than official narratives about those conditions. Here's where the documents become particularly interesting for this research. The Vatican sources that allegedly mention Tartaria in 1874 supposedly describe systematic demolition and reconstruction activities throughout the regions in question. Not natural disasters or gradual development, but coordinated infrastructure changes that were occurring rapidly across vast geographical areas. The correspondence supposedly discusses the challenge this presented for Catholic missionary work, because communities that had been accessible through established routes and communication networks were suddenly relocated or scattered, requiring new approaches to reach populations that maintained Catholic faith despite administrative disruption. The timing of 1874 is significant. This is 3 years after the major governmental reorganizations of 1871, but it's also the middle period of the systematic documentation and population management processes I've documented elsewhere in this research. If Vatican diplomats were observing and reporting on large-scale infrastructure changes and population displacements in Central Asian regions in 1874, those observations would provide independent corroboration for processes that were occurring simultaneously throughout North America and Europe. The Catholic Church maintained diplomatic and missionary networks that extended into regions where secular governments had limited presence or authority. Vatican correspondence could potentially document events that other administrative systems didn't record or chose not to record. The alleged 1874 documents also supposedly contain references to technological capabilities that seem inconsistent with documented 19th century construction practices. Vatican diplomatic reports supposedly describe construction and demolition work proceeding at speeds that impressed church officials who were familiar with major European building projects. Infrastructure changes occurring across thousands of miles of territory within timeframes that seemed impossible given available transportation and construction technology. Some correspondents allegedly expressed concern that these changes were disrupting traditional pilgrimage routes and communication networks that had connected Catholic communities across Asia for centuries. What makes these alleged Vatican references particularly compelling is their supposed matter-of-fact tone. The documents supposedly don't present Tartaria as a mysterious or legendary entity requiring explanation. Instead, they treat it as a known political and geographical reality that has recently changed status, creating practical, administrative challenges for Catholic Church operations in affected regions. Vatican diplomats supposedly wrote about former Tartarian territories, the way they would write about any other territorial transition, as an administrative reality requiring practical responses rather than as a historical curiosity requiring investigation or explanation. The accessibility problems become more pronounced and systematically frustrating when contemporary researchers attempt to examine the Vatican archives directly, following standard scholarly procedures for accessing historical, ecclesiastical documents. Several historians working on projects related to 19th century Catholic missions in Central Asia have reported requesting access to the specific collections and document series that allegedly contain the 1874 Tartaria references, using the proper archival citation formats and following Vatican archive protocols for scholarly research applications. In some cases, they're told that those particular documents are not available for research consultation due to ongoing conservation work that requires the materials to be stored in climate-controlled environments with restricted access until preservation treatments can be completed. In other cases, the specific document numbers and series references cited in the academic literature don't correspond to materials that Vatican archivists can locate using current filing and cataloging systems that have been upgraded and standardized over recent decades. Some researchers report being informed that the documents they're seeking to examine have been transferred to different archival collections within the Vatican system during organizational modernization projects. Time equals 600 milliseconds/, or that they've been reclassified under different subject headings and filing categories as the archives have adopted more sophisticated organizational methods that better serve contemporary scholarly research needs. Others are told that the materials they've requested access to are restricted for diplomatic reasons related to ongoing Catholic Church relationships with governments in regions that were discussed in the historical correspondence, even though the documents in question are 150 years old and concern political entities that no longer exist according to mainstream historical understanding. These access complications create a frustrating research environment where documents that are cited in legitimate academic publications by credentialed scholars with institutional affiliations remain inaccessible to independent verification by other researchers who wish to examine the same sources. This is problematic for normal scholarly discourse, which depends on the ability of researchers to examine each other's sources, verify citations, and build upon previous work through direct engagement with primary source materials. When documents become inaccessible, academic conversation becomes impossible because subsequent scholars can't determine whether cited sources actually support the claims being made about their contents, whether those sources have been accurately interpreted and represented, or whether the sources exist at all in the forms described. The Vatican Archive Administration maintains that their access policies are transparent, consistently applied, and designed to balance scholarly research needs with institutional requirements for document preservation and diplomatic sensitivity management. Vatican archivists work with researchers from around the world, providing access to millions of historical documents through procedures that have been refined over decades of scholarly collaboration. The archive system has been progressively modernized and digitized, making more materials available to more researchers than ever before, while implementing conservation protocols that protect fragile historical materials from damage caused by excessive handling or inappropriate environmental exposure. From the Vatican's institutional perspective, there should be no particular reason to restrict access to 19th century diplomatic correspondence about Central Asian territorial changes and population movements unless those documents contain information that remains diplomatically sensitive, or unless the physical condition of the materials requires conservation treatment that temporarily limits access. If documents from 1874 mentioning Tartaria existed in Vatican collections, were properly cataloged according to standard archival practices, and didn't involve ongoing diplomatic sensitivities, they should be accessible to qualified researchers through normal application and consultation procedures that the Vatican has established for scholarly access to historical materials. But the pattern of inaccessibility, specifically around documents that allegedly reference Tartaria, is notable and difficult to explain through ordinary archival complexity, conservation requirements, or administrative reorganization challenges. The concentration of access problems around this particular topic, combined with the specific nature of the research obstacles that different scholars have encountered, suggests either remarkable coincidence in the timing of conservation work, filing system changes, and diplomatic sensitivity classifications, or deliberate management of access to materials that contain information the Vatican prefers to keep restricted from scholarly examination and public discussion. But there's another possibility. Archives are not neutral repositories. They reflect the priorities and perspectives of the institutions that maintain them. The Catholic Church in the 1870s was navigating complex political changes throughout Europe and Asia, including the unification of Italy, the decline of Ottoman authority, and Russian imperial expansion. Vatican diplomatic correspondence from this period would contain observations about political and territorial changes that might not align with the narratives that emerged as dominant historical accounts of these processes. Documents that described alternative political entities, population displacements, or infrastructure changes inconsistent with official histories might be genuinely sensitive even 150 years later. Consider what it would mean if Vatican archives contained matter-of-fact references to Tartaria as a recent political entity in 1874. Not as a vague geographical designation or European misconception about Asian territories, but as a specific administrative reality that Vatican diplomats had direct knowledge of through their missionary and diplomatic networks. Such documents would provide institutional corroboration for alternative historical frameworks that mainstream academia has dismissed as conspiracy theories or misinterpretation of historical sources. The Catholic Church's institutional credibility and scholarly reputation would become associated with claims that contradict established historical consensus. The research trail goes cold in ways that are difficult to explain through ordinary archival complexity. Documents that are cited in legitimate academic publications by credentialed researchers become inaccessible to subsequent scholars who attempt to verify those citations. The Vatican archives acknowledge that their filing systems have evolved and that some historical materials may be difficult to locate using current organizational methods. But the concentration of accessibility problems around the specific topic of Tartaria suggests either remarkable coincidence or deliberate inaccessibility. Contemporary Vatican archival policy emphasizes transparency and scholarly access. The Church has opened previously restricted collections, digitized significant portions of its holdings, and established procedures designed to support legitimate historical research. The current administration presents itself as committed to historical accuracy and scholarly cooperation. If documents from 1874 mentioning Tartaria existed and contained historically significant information, Vatican policy suggests they should be made available to researchers rather than restricted or misfiled in ways that prevent verification. The alternative explanation is that the documents never existed, and the academic papers that cite them are based on misunderstandings, mistranslations, or fraudulent sources. Scholars working in the 1980s and 1990s might have misinterpreted references to Tartary as Tartaria, or they might have encountered forged documents that seemed authentic but weren't. The Vatican archives might never have contained the correspondence that researchers believed they were citing. The accessibility problems could reflect archivists' attempts to clarify that the documents being requested don't exist, rather than attempts to restrict access to sensitive materials. But that explanation requires accepting that multiple credentialed historians published academic papers citing Vatican sources that they never actually examined, or that they examined materials that they fundamentally misunderstood or misrepresented. It requires believing that professional scholars with institutional affiliations and reputations to protect cited specific Vatican archival references without conducting appropriate verification. While scholarly errors occur, the systematic nature of these citations and their concentration around the specific topic of Tartaria makes simple error difficult to accept as a complete explanation. The Vatican documents that allegedly mention Tartaria in 1874 remain inaccessible through normal scholarly channels. The academic papers that cite them continue to exist in legitimate journals, but their sources can't be independently verified by contemporary researchers. Time equals 2 seconds / the Vatican maintains that its archival policies support scholarly access while protecting institutional interests and conservation requirements. The documents either exist and are being restricted for reasons the Vatican hasn't publicly explained, or they never existed, and multiple academic publications contain citations to materials that weren't properly verified before publication. Either possibility raises questions about how historical evidence is controlled, verified, and made available to researchers investigating topics that challenge established historical narratives. The 1874 Vatican correspondence that supposedly mentioned Tartaria by name may be the most direct institutional evidence that such a political entity existed in the 19th century. Or it may be an example of how alternative historical claims can penetrate academic literature without adequate verification, creating citations to sources that don't actually support the claims being made. The documents remain elusive, their contents unverifiable, their very existence uncertain. But their alleged presence in Vatican archives, if true, would transform understanding of 19th century political geography and the processes that shaped the modern world. The trail leads to Rome, to archives that contain centuries of documented history. But the specific trail that leads to Tartaria disappears into filing systems that no longer align, collections that can't be located, and documents that may never have existed at all.